Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back. Okay, let's continue our discussion on um, religion and how we see the world when it connects to religion. And one of the reasons, or many of the reasons why, as anthropologists, we really do focus on religion to help us understand why people do the things that they do. Right. So religion is a means in which we try to understand the world and our place in it. Again, this is really important to sort of contemplate. Um, when we think about religion itself, um, religion could very well be one of the reasons why, as a species, we have gotten to where we are. And I think it's important to kind of understand that, especially when it comes to the connection between religion and science. The thing about religion is that we use it to explain the world, right? This is happening. I don't entirely know why, which means that we have to have an explanation for it. God did it, right? This was God's choice. Um, this was bound to happen. This was foretold. This was a prophecy. This is God's will, right? All of those things are explanations for events, as reasoning for why things happen. And to think about that in sort of the evolutionary process of us as a species, um, if we compare ourselves to, say, dogs, cats, right? When they experience, say, a thunderstorm, right? There's lightning, there's thunder, and for them, they are reacting to the situation. They're reacting to that event, but they aren't asking why that event is taking place. And that's kind of the difference between sort of the majority of the animal kingdom and humans ourselves, is that we look for those reasons. Now, if we go back in time to um, trying to understand those things, if we didn't have a viable capability of understanding, it didn't mean that we didn't crave answers, right? I'm a Viking and there's a storm coming, and I'm trying to understand why this storm is happening at the exact moment that I don't need it to happen, right? Am I being punished for something? Why is this happening? Why is this ruining all of the stuff that's going on? Why is this thunder and lightning taking place? Maybe it's because I pissed off Thor, right? Thor, he's pissed off at me and he's going to send all this thunder, and it's scary, and it's causing the waves to get crazy because I live on the shore. We know that weather patterns happen for a reason, right? The heating and the cooling of the environment, which creates those storms, and the change in moisture. And then we also know that there's the ions in the air, positively and negatively charged, create an imbalance, and that electrical imbalance then has to correct itself, and we get a bolt of lightning, and that lightning then creates that reverberation of the air, and we get that thunder. Guess what? We know through scientific reasoning that's why things happen. But in previous generations, that knowledge wasn't there. But we still needed to know why. And we created those reasons, right? And that's the approach that anthropology oftentimes take. Again, it's not the validity of a religion or a practice, right? But to understand the people within that religion, to take their word for it, right? I'm not going to walk into someone's religion and say, well, this doesn't fit with my beliefs, so I'm going to discount it. Instead, I'm going to try and understand why why it does that, and the kind of influence that it has had on us in general. And I think religion is one of those really powerful things that nearly every community has around the world. there are very few instances where we don't actually see a religion. Um, and it's because, again, how do we explain the world? What capability do we have? Religion is a huge, huge part of that explanation as to why we exist in this world. Um, it is a set of beliefs and rituals that create a unique way of viewing the world by introducing supernatural powers. Again, we talked about this idea of, how do we control our place in the world, right? How do we understand it? How do we relate to it? Creating those symbols, creating those rituals in which we practice it together. And by doing those things together, we reinforce our connection to each other. And that's how these cultures work, right? It's all about that interconnectivity. And again, oftentimes religion is at the basis, the foundation of many, many cultures. We don't, again, seek the validity of religion, rather to seek the understanding of the role people see themselves in that religion and how they live and view that religious experience. What does it mean to them to live in this place and to experience all of these things? So that's really important for us to pay attention to. We really want to look at really looking at religion through their own eyes and walking in their shoes to gain that experience, right? One of the best things that you can do is, if you're interested in learning about other religions, go to their church or their mosque or their temple and experience it for yourself, right? Learn by practice. Learn by experiencing it with the people that are experiencing it on a daily basis. And you can get to understand the meaning behind it. One of the most prolific experiences I had as an undergrad is I had a world religions class, and in that class, we had to go to different churches, and we had to go to a mosque, and we had to go to a temple, and we had to experience what it was like to go to these different places and to see and experience what it was like to be there, so that you would have a better understanding of that community. And it was by far one of the best experiences that I had because it gave us a chance to really see what it was like during a prayer session, to understand the connection between people. So if you want to live and learn about another culture, practice with them, right? Whatever that religion or whatever is, right? Do it with that group. We also look from the global perspective to the local perspective, right? If we are looking at different churches, for example, if we take the Catholic Church, right? We can look to Rome, we can look to the Vatican, and we can see the connection that the Pope has, right? And how important the Pope's position is within Catholicism. And even if we look at like Pope Francis, who Francis himself is a left turn for sort of the papal history, right? The papacy. You've got this very long tradition of some pretty conservative ideas about how the world should work and how people within the Catholic religion should practice. And Francis comes along and kind of follows a lot of those guidelines, but has also opened up a few different ideas, right? Especially on his approach towards the LGBTQ community. The Catholic Church has persecuted a lot of LGBTQ folks in the past, still has really strong feelings about them today. But the Pope came along and said, hey, these are still your brothers and your sisters and your aunts and uncles and your mom and your dad and your children. and they deserve a spot at the table. They deserve respect. They deserve all the things that humans deserve, um, which is a little bit of a turn coming from the Catholic Church that has traditionally not had those same sort of guidelines. And taking away sort of the ethical or moral ideas on that, right? Me as an individual, I might say, yeah, way to go, Pope. I like your approach. But as the anthropologist in me, now I'm sitting here going, okay, so look at the history, right? What has happened in the past? What is this particular Pope doing today? And how is that going to impact the people not only within the church but outside of the church, right? Is there going to be spillover into other denominations within the Christian faith? Is this going to have long-term impacts? What is the next pope going to do? Are they going to stay on track with what Francis is doing, or are they going to go back to more of the traditional approach? What's going to happen next? Again, not necessarily assigning a right or wrong to it, but trying to understand the process in which that is taking place, and then how it's going to filter from that global perspective into all the little places around the world where each diocese, each church with each preacher is going to have to navigate those ideas and concepts individually, and then how each practitioner is going to relate to those ideas, right? So when we look at sort of the global ideas and those connections, how does that relate to the local? Okay, moving on. Religion is constantly changing and adapting to new situations. And this is typically fairly true. When it comes to how much is changing can sometimes depend on the church itself, and the rate of change can depend on how much outside influence is taking place. We can look at a number of different religious practices. Christianity itself, in some places, has been fairly static for a long time, with certain beliefs maintaining their strength. In other places, it changes and morphs to accommodate the current circumstances, right? And this is why we have that deviation oftentimes between, say, like the different practices within Christianity. And this is, we've got the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Mormons. All of these folks still have this similar connection to Christianity, but they have different views on it, different ways to look at it. They create different rules to suit their needs. And so, depending on the rate of change, different communities are going to adapt differently. And this is important to take a look at. What is the relationship between these different communities? Why are things changing at different rates? Religion can oftentimes be the foundation of peace and love and respect, or it can also be the place where anger and hate and fear can manifest. And in this case, a lot of times it depends, again, on those sort of fundamental ideals, but then also connecting to the agency of individuals, right? Do you have the capability of swaying people to believe one thing or another? How do you influence those people involved, the practitioners? And this can either be sort of the foundation for, love and how people can heal and help others, or it can lead to things like war, right? And how people are going to, fight over political and religious beliefs, right? And we've seen both take place, being done for lots of different reasons. Sometimes religious, sometimes connected to religion, sometimes it's just resources in the name of religion, right? But oftentimes there are these certain set of ideals that get connected, and we have to look at those and try and understand what's actually happening, right? It's been the driving force between civil rights movement and also has allowed the death of millions, right? So again, right and wrong. Um, each culture determines what is right and wrong. Each culture figures out what is the appropriate thing to do, right? If we go back in time into American history and we look at some of the stuff that we have done, say like Christianity, uh, it was absolutely and totally acceptable to own slaves, right? And uh, the morals and values of the Christian religion, and for those that practiced it, believed that this was the case, right? In some ways, we can look at subjects like manifest destiny, right? That the conquering of the West as American expansion moved westward, that was ordained by God, or at least that was the idea that it was ordained, and that anything that we came across, it didn't matter if people were hurt or killed. This idea of manifest destiny allowed for those things to happen, right? So, it all depends on the people, right? People using those methods of control, of power, to do the things that they want to do. And religion oftentimes gets used that way. We oftentimes think about religion as a personal experience, right? You might be religious, you attend church, you have a connection to your God, your creator, whoever that is, if you are religious. Um, and we don't oftentimes sort of connect sort of the fundamental herd sort of mentality that religion oftentimes focuses us on, right? Even the ideology amongst some Christian ideals, right? Sort of the shepherd and the flock, right? You have the shepherd who is that God. That shepherd then also sort of transmutes into the preacher, right? That priest, that rabbi, that imam, that shaman, right? And then they are the ones that, sort of lead the group by the religious ideology and ideals and goals that that group has in particular. So there can be a lot of power that can be associated um, with that God, and then move for whatever those people's intentions are. And we know that not everybody is good. Not every preacher has been good. And when that is the case, right, can that stuff be looked at and seen as like, oh, this is bad, this is wrong? We have to look for those things. It can define the foundation of how we live, right? And again, I've talked about how important religion has been in sort of creating, again, those rules and guidelines as to how we should live and how we should engage with each other, right? Even if you don't practice today, again, that ideology has slipped into our daily lives. If you live in the United States, you're going to be impacted by the Christian faith, even if you're an atheist, even if you're agnostic, even if you're Buddhist or Taoist. Christianity will have an impact on you, right? And it's because it is a prevalent religion, but its ideology, its values have been a part of the mainstream culture and has impacted everything, right? So even if you don't practice it, you are definitely influenced by it, okay? All right, switching gears here, we're going to talk a little bit about rites of passage as an aspect of many religions and cultures in general, but it's oftentimes connected to the religious practice. We have what's considered like a rite of passage. What does that mean? Well, a rite of passage is usually one transition to another, right? How do we move from childhood into adulthood? How do we transition from life into death? You know, how do we see ourselves um, as professionals versus amateurs? And we go through these things of rites of passage. If we think about the college experience or high school, right? When you get that degree, right, that piece of paper that says that you have completed, you know, all of the assignments and have, you know, come to the conclusion of your education, and we're going to bestow upon you this right. You know, you have completed college. Well, that itself is a rite of passage, right? When you go to your graduation ceremony and you walk across that stage and you get that piece of paper handed to you and you wear the cap and gown, that is a rite of passage, right? You have completed this task, and at the end of this task is this ceremony that signifies that you have completed this effort, right? Sometimes that effort is just being born, right? But in other cases, like graduating, going to school, um, we see things in various rites of passage, like birth, right? And in some cases, birth is seen as a rite of passage, going from the spiritual realm to the physical realm, right? Allowing your soul to move into a physical body, if that's the religious practice that you believe in, right? A pilgrimage, right? Pilgrimages are oftentimes going to some sort of like a holy land or a holy place. We have a coming of age, right? Um, that coming of age is stepping away from childhood into adulthood, right? And that coming of age is usually connected to, uh, uh, you know, either attaining puberty, um, or obtaining some sort of, um, you know, like a uh, completing some sort of aspect like a bar mitzvah or a quinceañera, where you've attained this age and now, again, you're becoming a part of the adult um, realm instead of being a child. Now you've got more responsibilities, but also maybe more freedom. Obtaining a special honor or accomplishment, again, talking about graduating school. A baptism, right? A lot of times a baptism is a rite of passage for a child, and usually done in early ages, but not always. But that baptism, especially if we look at the Christian baptism, is your soul being saved. Right now, you've got the chance to get into heaven. If you're not baptized, you're gonna go to hell or purgatory or wherever. But if you get baptized and you have this rite done to you, right? All of a sudden now you've got that access, right? Marriage is also seen as a rite of passage in many cultures. When you get married, you actually attain adult status, right? Prior to that, you are still sort of a child, right? But once you're married and then can then engage in bearing children, and building family and connecting to the culture in an adult way, now it becomes, really important. And we also have to look at how cultures look at marriage, and sort of like even ages of marriage, and when is that appropriate, and what is marriage, right? For us, especially in today's culture, marrying when you get out of high school is kind of frowned upon. If you go back a generation or two, getting married outside of high school was commonplace, and it was totally appropriate for the culture at the time. Today, that doesn't happen as often. People are waiting longer and longer before they get married. Um, there are cultures around the world, especially agrarian or nomadic cultures, that don't have the same sort of connection to timelines like we do, right? We expect to get out of high school somewhere around the age of 18. What happens when you live in an agrarian community where they don't have the same sort of schooling that we have in Western culture? But by the time they're age 12 or 13, they have learned all the things they need to learn about as far as becoming an adult. And so at that age, their maturity level has reached adulthood. And then that becomes the age that is appropriate for them to get married. Now, we might look at that culture and say, whoa, 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 that's like childhood marriage. But for that community, ethically, morally, it's totally acceptable for that to take place. Because at that age, they have become an adult, right? So, how we look at other cultures, again, this is coming down to sort of um, that ethical and moral bias that we might have about another culture. We have to really pay attention to that. If I were to look at that culture and I just say, hey, that's wrong. You guys shouldn't be marrying at 13, 14 years old. Because my culture, 13 and 14-year-olds, they're treated like kids. They behave like kids. They don't have adult responsibilities. And so they are not adults, right? They have all the rights and responsibilities of adults. And so they gain that access earlier. Again, leaving aside my own morals and values of what I think is appropriate, I want to know, how does this impact these individuals, right? And so that can mean different things. That rite of passage of marriage, right, now might transmit you from being child to adult. And then death, right? Death as a rite of passage. And I think, again, in even in our own culture, especially with Christian beliefs, death is that transmission to heaven, right? And if you've been a good person, then that's the next stage in existence, right? Your spirit carries on, your body dies off. Lots and lots of cultures deal with this concept of death, right? What happens to you when you die? And many believe in sort of the soul or spirit and how it's going to live on after. If you recall the film Dead Birds, right? After death, your spirit still exists. And those spirits have a lot of influence on your daily activities, right? If you were killed by someone from a neighboring tribe, your spirit would demand some sort of vengeance and wouldn't find peace until that vengeance was met, right? And so then you as a people go out and you fight a little war, you do a little raid, you kill someone on the other side. Now that spirit can be satisfied and can go back into a state of peace. So, right, that's huge influence within within this community, within the Dani peoples of Papua New Guinea. Now we can look at Christianity and see the same sort of thing, right? What motivates Christians to act and behave a certain way? If it isn't ghosts, if it isn't spirits, right? It's just looked at differently. It's looked at in a different context of being true, right, versus another religion, a myth, right? But Christianity looks at the same thing, right? They practice what happens with death in very similar ways, and you have expectations of what you should do to be able to attain that heavenly experience versus hell, right? What are those motivations, and can they move people to do great and wonderful things or great and terrible things? Okay, talk a little bit more about pilgrimages. If we look at a pilgrimage, um, a lot of times it's not just the destination that people are after, right? You might conduct this pilgrimage, and in the process, you have to walk. And of course, I'm trying to remember the name of the pilgrimage, Christian pilgrimage in Spain. But you basically follow this. You do this hike that you take days to go on, and you get to this destination, and there's this religious experience. But it's not just about the destination. Oftentimes, it's about following in the footsteps of your ancestors, right? When we think about the pilgrimage that Muslims take to Mecca, right? You're supposed to go there at least once in your life, right? To be able to go and pilgrimage there. If you look at Judaism and pilgrimaging to Jerusalem, right? And this is something that you have to do at some point to connect to your religion, to have that shared experience of what it's like to be and to live in that same place. And that you can share those connections with everyone else that has done that. So a lot of times it's not the destination that counts, but it's that journey of getting there that really makes a big difference. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a twist here because we're going to look at a couple of different ideologies around religion. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of Emile Durkheim's idea on the sacred and the profane. And the idea is that Durkheim was kind of looking at the practical side of religion. You know, if we think about the motivations, what becomes sacred? These are things that have a huge impact in a positive way to your society, and so we want to create behaviors that focus on those things, right? And then we have the unholy, and these are the things that are bad and negative within that culture. And so we create consequences for those things. Now, one of the things that Durkheim was really interested in is this concept in which sort of what has happened through the process of globalism, right? If we go back in the United States 100 years, and we think about sort of the family structures that were common at that time, we saw that most families lived relatively close to each other, if not within the same spaces. You might have multiple generations living in a household. You might have brothers and sisters with their families living in the same household, or at least maybe in the same neighborhood, right? The same community. But then, with the invention of easy transportation, easy and cheap transportation, we could move our families and follow opportunity, right? Maybe you were living in St. Louis and you wanted to go to Oregon, to Portland, because you heard that there is a good job there, right? You're going to follow the Oregon Trail. Here's the thing. His concern was that if you were to do that, if you were to take your family and travel to another location, that your religion would start to fail, right? That your dedication to your religion, your dedication to those morals and the values and the ethical sort of substance that you have learned from your religion and your community was going to diminish by spreading out. And so a lot of those traditional ideals also got changed as people started spreading out to new places. And as they moved to new places, they were also introduced to new ideas. And they didn't have that family back home to maintain those rituals, maintain those practices that reinstilled and re-engaged those beliefs all the time. Now you're this individual, or you've got your small nuclear family in a new location, and you're being exposed to all these different ideas. And that in that case, that is literally how the United States has engaged in globalism and the right of the individual. We can kind of look at this as a model for the United States as they have moved from, um, small communities, especially in the East, and moved westward, especially as small nuclear families. They have not engaged in the same sort of religious activity and not had their religion as uh, as capable, because it wasn't always reinforced. Now, a lot of times you might move to a community that has already established, right, that religious practice, right? Somebody moves to San Francisco and they start up a Baptist church, and then you're going to have people that are other Baptists, and they're going to hear about this church, and they're like, oh, I want to go to San Francisco because there's a church there already, and I can find community there. But you're oftentimes creating new community, and there's still an element of change from that newness, because you might have people that are Baptist but are coming from St. Louis or Milwaukee or from New York or from Georgetown, right? You might have all these folks that are moving out west. They might all be Baptist, but they're gonna have different experiences. So that's going to change that as well. And so Durkheim was concerned that this could have sort of a major impact on culture, and sort of the ethics of that culture. And I'd say that he was pretty well on track with how things were going to change as people moved away from those safe and familiar reinforcing communities to new communities. Um, and that's how we've seen sort of our culture change and adapt from how it used to be. Then we have Karl Marx. Marx had a very interesting um, take on religion. He considered it to be the opiate of the masses. Um, what does that mean? So he was highly critical of religion itself. He oftentimes believed that religion was a means of social control, and it is a means of social control because it creates those morals and values, the norms of behavior. Um, but for him, he took it to like the next level of, uh, you know, uh, that it was used as a form of control to control the proletariat individuals. These are the common folks. These are the workers, and that the bourgeoisie are going to be the business owners, the religious leaders, the political leaders, are going to use their influence to make the poor, the workers, the um, blue collars, right, to do things that they probably wouldn't want to do but are coerced into doing, right? One of these concepts being that, say um, you're told that, if you suffer now, right, you're going to suffer, you're going to labor hard, um, but at the end of your suffering, you're going to go to heaven, and heaven is a beautiful place. But to get to heaven, you have to earn it, right? To get there, you have to suffer now, and you have to toil, and you have to do all these things, and you have to, um, give patronage to your church, and you have to pay tithings, and you have to do all these things that help you, gain that entrance into heaven, and really ignore your rights and your benefits today, that if you were to just complain a little bit, life might get better. But he would say, hey, these guys are controlling you, profiting from you, right? and promising you something that doesn't really exist, right? And so that was Marx's kind of like idea that um, instead of focusing on cultural disparities and the things that's happening between the haves and the have-nots, um, the people were just forced into this practice that wasn't beneficial. But they would see those benefits later on. Um, so Marx has a really strong viewpoint about religion, right, and how detrimental it is. And I think it's important to understand that um, while as anthropologists we study Marx and can discuss some of his ideas, it's important to know those things, but you know, to take the same approach when it comes to every religion, I think is harmful. Again, because we're also placing um, personal bias and personal ethics into what's going on, right? Now we might see what Marx is seeing happening, um, but what we want to understand is those mechanisms. Now, I'm not saying that as an individual you shouldn't go out and make a difference and contribute if that's something that you absolutely believe in. I'm coming from sort of the scientific background, right? That as a scientist, I want to understand the reasons why, and then if people want to act on those, they can. But those are two different things, right? The understanding and the doing. Then we come to this concept of cultural materialism. And this is sort of the understanding of how people relate to their stuff, and how it can have sometimes unintended consequences. Marvin Harris, who wrote sort of this famous book, Callous Pigs, Wars, and Witches, believes that there's oftentimes a very practical reason for the cultural and religious ideas that we might have, right? He explores practices that don't seem to make a lot of sense or that might be counterintuitive, um, but it might have its origins in logical or ecological or practical understanding. And so, what would be like an example of this? So we can think about like kosher foods, right? If we look at Judaism and Islam, when it comes to kosher foods, what are the kinds of foods that kosher folks can eat or not eat? In this sense, we might look at like pork or shellfish. And I think what we'll do is we'll take a look at pork, and then we'll also take a look at cows here in just a second. If we look at pork, okay, so where did Judaism and Islam and Christianity develop? Right. Well, we're talking about the Middle East, oftentimes in very desert-like conditions. Well, we know that in a lot of places around the world, pigs are eaten constantly, right? They're, as far as I'm concerned, delicious and tasty. However, pigs as a biological entity do not fare well in desert-like conditions. They don't have an easy way of maintaining cool body temperatures, right? They don't sweat, or they don't sweat much, and so maintaining a cool temperature becomes very difficult. And one of the ways that they do maintain it, if they're in those hot places, is they're going to find whatever moisture that they possibly can. Now, they want to find water, right? Finding water, getting into water, cooling down helps a lot. If they don't have access to a lot of water, and you're not going to have a lot of water in a desert, they will roll around in their own feces to keep themselves cool, right? Whatever it is that can help them maintain that body temperature. And so we start seeing that, if people are experiencing that these pigs are rolling around in their own feces, that it can be gross and they can be disgusting animals. Um, but biologically speaking, they need to do that to be able to cool themselves. Um, and because of that, and because they can get sick, um, eating that and eating pork was also seen as a delicacy. Eating it can be, if they are sick, if they are, um, gross, rolling around in their own feces, guess what? Maybe it's not a good idea to keep pigs there. And you start to see the practical thing here, right? If you are encouraging people to keep pigs, but those pigs keep getting sick, um, and they're kind of gross, that's a negative impact on culture. And so to maintain that sort of social order, right, you ban the thing that could get people sick. And then that becomes a part of that religious practice, right? So while it functions perfectly well in the desert, right, not having pigs, because pigs don't do well in the desert, so we should make a rule that says you shouldn't have pigs in the desert. And so you create that social order. Now, right, when you move to a new location, you oftentimes take those rules with you and maintain them, even if you live in an area that is perfectly acceptable for pigs. If we go to, say, like India, right, and many places in India, if we look at Hinduism, you have the sacred cow, right? Cows are considered sacred. So you can't eat a cow unless under certain circumstances. So beef is really not a thing when you go to India, because again, like in a lot of places, cows can go wherever they want. If a cow wants to go into your shop and walk around, they can go into your shop and walk around. If a cow walks into the middle of the street and stops traffic, you're really not allowed to move that cow out of the way. In fact, they have special like cow police. Or if you get like a sick cow, the police department is where that sick cow might go to so that they can actually, be out of harm's way. So you can't really touch these cows. Now, cows themselves are not treated particularly well, right? A lot of them are underweight, skinny. They are scavengers, eating whatever they can. But they also provide something extremely valuable to this culture uh, in the means of manure, right? Manure itself, in a lot of small communities, is one of the few sort of renewable fuel sources. In various places, um, you have different um, levels within society. It's stratified. You have like the Brahmins, right? If you're part of the Brahmin class structure, you're usually wealthy, well educated. And at the bottom of this class structure, you have the untouchables, and these are the classless, the poor individuals, and you really can't get out of that. Even marriage, right? Marriage is highly regulated. If you're Brahmin and you meet someone that's an untouchable, you cannot get married. You cannot bring them up with you. And there's a very highly stratified structure going on there. Well, one of the ways that the untouchables actually can make a living is by going out and collecting this dung and from these cows and using it and selling it to families within those communities, usually to women, as cooking fuel, right? You toss it in your fireplace and it cooks your food, right? And from us, that seems pretty gross, right? It's like, oh, picking up manure and burning it in your house, and that's what you cook your food on. Well, yeah, that's how many of these communities live. Um, but it becomes part of the social rules that to be able to maintain this social order, you have to be able to enforce it, and you have to be able to give the people that are in there a means for survival. And one of those ways is to maintain this sort of idea of like the sacred cow. And there is a lot more to it, of course. But this is sort of the one of the ideas where practical reasoning can come in and explain the supernatural, explain the, the, the meaning behind cultural practices or religious practices. Um, so it helps us to understand the why this behavior might be going on, right? If we think about, again, looking at kosher foods, there's a good reason why a lot of those foods shouldn't be there, right? Because they can make you sick if you don't treat them right. If you don't cook pork at a certain temperature, you can get parasites. People weren't dumb back in the day. They saw this, they experienced it, and they put two and two together and said, pigs are bad, right? We shouldn't have them here because they don't survive well in this environment. We are getting sick from eating them. So we ban it, right? That becomes a part of the culture, that becomes ingrained within the religious practices, and then it continues even in places where the practicality no longer matters. Um, and so that's understanding, the specific aspects of a culture, of a religion, and understanding the practical means behind what we just take as sort of that religious ideology. Oftentimes, we can find a practical reason for just about everything when it comes to religious practices, if we look for it, right? Okay, then we have shamanism. Shamanism is considered to be pretty much the oldest practice of some sort of a religion, and shamanism itself is an overarching term that encapsulates lots of different religious practices, right? They might not all be the same, but they're oftentimes similar, right? Whether or not it's animism, which is taking a particular belief in an animal or multiple animals, embodying the aspects of those animals. Like if you um, are an indigenous person and are looking at being a part of like Bear Clan, or seeing different animals that you don't have an explanation for, right? Well, you might see them as totems, as spirit guides, right? And that shamanism helps create that order of understanding of how you relate to your environment, to your aspect of nature, and the things that you want to embody yourself, right? Shamans are oftentimes considered to be healers, so they take on multiple roles, not only just spiritual guides, spiritual healers, but also physical healers. Um, Oftentimes they live within the community as a general member, right? They might not always have the separate sort of position, but when they are needed, they are called upon, right, to fill that role. They're oftentimes associated with small rural communities, so communities that range in between dozens of people to thousands of people. You might have a shaman or multiple shamans that can engage in the spiritual and healing practices. And then you start to see, especially now, how shamanism is interacting with larger cultures and larger religions, and what's sort of happening in those places. What kinds of blends are we seeing? When I was working on the Ute Mountain Reservation, I got a chance to experience a lot of sort of traditional spiritual practices. And all of them had this connection to tradition and to history within the Utes, but it usually ended with prayers that ended with amen, right? Christianity had become a big part of that community and had blended itself into their traditional practices. And so we oftentimes look at the relationship between the shamanistic practices and those larger larger religions that might have that big influence, right? Whether it's through colonial practices, which we see in the United States, versus hegemonic practices, which is where we see that religious influence be accepted around the world because they might see it as more beneficial, um, or just just the adapting to a new situation, right? And having to work with other communities that also practice Christianity. Okay, we're going to pause there and then we'll come back and continue our discussion. All right, we'll see you in a few.